Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your reception. And this is my one opportunity to thank Picard and Chivas for their kindness and unexpected grace in inviting me to receive this award. It came as a complete surprise, as indeed much in my life and career has done. But for the last 3 days, my wife Sonny and I have been treated with so much kindness and generosity, not to mention hospitality, David. And we've had a delightful time, so delightful in fact that Dubai is going to be high on our list of return vacations sometime soon. Back in the 50s, when I was 14, I went to the cinema one night to see an epic movie called Moby Dick, starring the great Gregory Peck and, of course, Orson Welles as Father Mapple. The film ended, and I sat in my seat in the Asoldo Cinema, Dewsbury, on a rainy winter's evening, knowing that I had to catch a bus back home, but overwhelmed by the experience that I just had. But most particularly, without knowing anything about acting or the skill and dedication and devotion that it required, I was overwhelmed by Gregory Peck's performance as Captain Ahab. And as I walked to my bus stop, I found myself fantasizing about the life that someone like Gregory Peck must lead. What must it feel like to be up there on the big screen? What must it feel like to be such an adored and appreciated actor? What must it feel like to be so handsome and sexy? Well, my bus came and off I went home, thrilled by what I'd experienced. We will now jump forward several decades, and I am dressed in a 19th century whaler's captain's costume. I have a wooden leg, and I am stomping up and down the deck of the Pequod, haranguing a group of ghastly-looking sailors while a camera is rolling. Finally, the director calls cut, and I totter off to a specially prepared chair that I used throughout the filming of this movie, which allowed me to semi-squat without sitting. And it meant that I could prop my wooden leg out here in front of me. And while I was sitting there getting my breath back, a hand touched my shoulder, and a voice murmured in my ear, "You see, Patrick, you have the voice. I never had the voice." And I turned to my right, and there was Gregory Peck looking over my shoulder. Now this wasn't a delusion, it wasn't a fantasy. In fact, when I learned that I had been cast in this iconic role, I was horrified at the complexity and difficulty of it. And it was a friend of mine, Brent Spiner, the famous Data from Star Trek The Next Generation, said, "Well, there's only one man who can tell you about what acting Ahab is like, and that's Gregory Peck. Why didn't you get in touch with him?" So I wrote a little letter, and I came home one afternoon, back in the good old days of, answering machines. You remember answering machines? And I hit the button, a red light was flashing, and a voice said, "Patrick, this is Greg Peck. Of course, I'd love to see you." So I went over and had tea with him, and we spent a delicious 2 or 3 hours while he regaled me not just with information about playing the role, but with scandalous stories about the behavior of the director and some of his co-stars, and how he nearly died in the Irish Sea when the tow rope pulling the whale broke, and the ship lost him, and the fog was coming in. Why were they in the Irish Sea? They were supposed to be in the South Pacific. They were in the Irish Sea because the director liked to go hunting on his estate in Ireland every weekend. Well, then Greg called up our producer, Robert Holme, and said, look, I would like to play the role of Captain Maple, Father Maple, who delivers the sermon just before the Pequod sails. And so we included in our cast the great Gregory Peck. And on this particular day I mentioned, he had come to watch us filming the great scene when Ahab finally tells the sailors about Moby Dick. I didn't know he was coming because can you imagine what it would have been like to have been delivering that speech, knowing that Gregory Peck was behind the camera? But my life has not been one of stars and celebrities. On the contrary, I had only one simple ambition when I was young, and that was to be on a stage in front of a live audience, and if possible, speaking Shakespeare, with the best possible actors around me that the English stage could provide. Television, I had no interest in, and film was a fantasy. Of course, I went to the movies, but it was never a career that I imagined myself playing a part in. Never. So, after a number of years as a professional actor, I joined the Royal Shakespeare Company and stayed with them, as you've commented. Was it that long? Yes, I suppose it was. You must have done your research. And never wanted to go anywhere else because I was as happy as a person could be. Speaking Shakespeare with wonderful actors and great directors. And then something happened. What happened was that I was on a private, small lecture tour in Southern California. And I was staying with a friend of mine, a professor of English at UCLA. And one night he said to me, look, I'm giving a public lecture on campus this week in Royce Hall. It's a lecture about Shakespearean comedy. Now, they don't just want to hear me droning on, talking as a scholar about it. Would you and another friend of mine, an actress, be prepared to come in and read extracts from some of the plays? And there's $100 in it for you. Ooh. I didn't hesitate. Snapped up the opportunity, and we went on. We did my friend did his lecture, we did our performances, and we went off and spent the $200. What I didn't know was that signed up for that course of public lectures was a man called Robert Justman. Robert Justman was one of the producers of the new series, Star Trek: The Next Generation. And for years before he died, Robert told me, and his wife confirmed that it was true, that at some point during this evening he turned to his wife and said, "We found the captain." So that was chance. If I had not been in Royce Hall at UCLA that evening, none of this would have happened. So you cannot underestimate the power of good fortune. But there are other qualities that you can measure and estimate. And one of them is to do with personal courage. As a young actor, because of my upbringing, my background, and my childhood, I was easily intimidated, easily overwhelmed by circumstances, even though I was happy to be on a stage. But I never fully trusted my own instinct, my own belief in my personal abilities. I was always ready to believe that somebody else knew more than I did. And then one day I was lucky enough to work with the director who was able to turn all of that around. And what he said was, what makes you special and unique exists inside you. But if you don't let it out, we will never know what it is. So you have to take risks. You have to be brave. You have to believe that if you go out there with all of your own personal emotions exposed, the sky will not fall on your head. And that's how I've led my life since then. And one of the reasons that I have is because of a quote from our great Prime Minister and wartime leader, Winston Churchill. And I wish that I had known this remark much earlier in my career, because it would have made a difference. Winston Churchill said, "The greatest virtue is courage, because it makes all the other virtues possible." Thank you. We're going to have some questions now. Where am I to go?
I'll come and take a seat here.
Thank you.
Nicely said. Well, where do we begin? You've played such a big variety of roles, as we saw on your little video earlier. You've had such an impressive career over, 50, 60 years. But I think for a lot of us, perhaps your most beloved role for many of us has to be in Star Trek. I want to ask you about what it was like playing this role that became such an iconic role. Were you much of a Trekkie fan to begin with?
I had to ask my children what Star Trek was. I do remember that when my son was young and I was working in Stratford-on-Avon, I would do a matinee performance, jump in my car and drive quickly back to the cottage where I lived so that I could read him a bedtime story, tuck him up. But whenever I got back there at about 6 o'clock on a Saturday evening, he was always watching this program on television with these chaps in colored T-shirts. Well, of course, he was watching the original Star Trek series in the 60s. And they were the ones who told me about what Star Trek actually meant. But I never believed that I was a serious contender for the role. I was called back to Los Angeles 3 times from England, and I was at the point of transferring a production into the West End, a production of Edward Albee's great play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, when a call came from my agent in Hollywood saying, "This is it. It's down to 2 of you." By the way, I never learned who the other actor was.
That's my next question.
Time to time, people have threatened to tell me, but I have my own idea, but it's never been confirmed. And I went back and did my final audition, this time for the studio. It seems that the production had already decided who they wanted, but the studio had to have the final say. And this is not generally well known. But I did that final audition wearing a toupee or hairpiece or a wig, whatever you want to call it, because they thought they could not possibly have a bald captain of the Enterprise. When the audition was over, I went back and the hairdresser was taking this thing off, and the executives from Paramount came in just to say goodbye and thank you. And she said to me, "You know why they came, don't you? They wanted to see what you looked like without that silly thing on your head." Well, the production opened, and during the first press conference, someone asked Gene Roddenberry, the creator, the original creator of Star Trek, why would you possibly have a bald man in the 24th century? Surely the cure for male pattern baldness will exist by then. And Gene Roddenberry said, "No, because in the 24th century, no one will care."
But if we look at what some of your co-stars said at the time, because it was a bold choice. It was a left field choice, wasn't it, to get a Shakespearean actor for so many ways. Marina Sirtis, for example, says that at least 50%, if not more, of the show's success was because the other actors imitated you, your professionalism, and you're dedicated to the craft of acting. To what extent is that true?
It's embarrassingly true. I was an awfully stuffy and rather dull individual. I didn't have much fun. I hadn't had that much fun, really, in my life. And then here I was shooting this series, and I came to believe after a couple of months that there was too much messing about on the set, too much laughing and jokes and giggling and singing songs. So I called the cast, the principal cast, together, the fellow crew members of the Enterprise. And I made a speech to them, and it makes my toes curl to think about. And I lectured them about how they were having too much of a good time. I said, don't you realize that we're here to work and that there are some people on this set who come here 5 days a week and they work for 12, 14 hours. They don't get days off like we do. We need to get those people back to their homes. And Denise Crosby, who was still at that time playing Natasha Yar, said, but Patrick, we've got to have some fun. And I famously, infamously said, we are not here to have fun. Yes, Marina likes to remind me of that. But I think we all decided early on that we would try and make this the best drama we possibly could. We all cared deeply about what we said. We cared about the script. We didn't want to have banalities. We wanted to be saying intelligent and provocative things. And then, as a result of this ludicrous speech of mine, I came to realize that there was another way of working and that it was possible to enjoy yourself and do good work at the same time. And so we stuck with that. I had been told that the series would be a failure. Everyone in Hollywood I consulted when I was trying to make up my mind said, oh, no, don't worry about signing a contract for 6 years because you'll never make it. You can't revive an iconic series like Star Trek. So go ahead, sign it. Make some money, meet a few girls, get a suntan, and go home.
And very quickly picking up on that point about every line mattered, I've heard you quoted as saying that actually there's a social message in Star Trek. It's not as if the Shakespeare stuff, the high culture, has the value, and Star Trek, the pop culture, was just idle entertainment. It's not as simple as that. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. It's most categorized, I suppose, by something that happened quite early on when I was being interviewed. And the interviewer suggested that given my history, the classical theater that I had worked in and so forth, that he didn't say this, but it was suggested that somehow I was slumming by being involved in a syndicated science fiction TV show. And I found that so pertinent. It's rare in the media, of course, that people are impertinent like that, isn't it? Extremely rare. And I said to this interviewer, look, all those years of sitting in thrones of England while I was working with the Royal Shakespeare Company was nothing but a preparation for the captain's chair of the Enterprise. Conversation over.
I mean, you certainly lend, I guess, a certain gravitas to all of the roles you've done, obviously in Star Trek, but also X-Men as well, that sort of emotional intelligence, the faith in humanity you have there. Is that something that can be learned? Is it about that iconic voice, the body language, the physicality?
That's a very hard question. I respected both Jean-Luc Picard, and I do respect, because he is an ongoing character, Charles Xavier, a great deal. And both of them had philosophies that very much coincided with mine. And therefore, I was able to bring a lot of myself and my own feeling to this. But you never want to lecture people, do you? You never want to say to them, you are not here to have fun. There are other ways of achieving what you desire, and that was what was behind the interpretation of Jean-Luc Picard, and certainly Charles Xavier, who is an extraordinary fictional character and gives me a lot of satisfaction to play. But the fact is, they have both, in a way, been albatrosses around my neck. Now, I'm sorry if this gives offense to Trekkies out there in the audience or Marvel comic fans, but having become so identified with these two characters, it became a little difficult when finally Star Trek was over to have other people consider me for other work. I even heard one day a director who I'd been trying to get a meeting with for weeks and weeks for a film role that I wanted. And he said to me, well, look, you're a terrific actor, and it's great that you wanted to come in and talk to me. But why would I want Captain Picard in my movie? Well, it's hard to accept that because it seems like a life sentence. And yet, the life sentence, it would seem, has been broken. And for that, I have to thank some unusual choices. I have to thank social media and my wife, Sunny, who has been my guide and guru for everything to do with social media. And a suspicion that maybe the greatest satisfaction in the work that I do, as Laurence Olivier said in an interview many years ago, oh, it's marvelous to hear people sob or gasp at the drama of what you're playing, but nothing compares with hearing people laugh. And increasingly in the last few years, I've found that to be true.